In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was sitting in a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. One of King's friends smuggled in a newspaper to King so that he could read it. In this paper was published an open letter to Dr. King by predominantly white evangelical pastors condemning King for his timing, for being too loud, and for his methods. You heard me, white Christians trying to school Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on his ways of doing things that they were just all wrong. Welcome back to my Thoughtful Thursdays channel, where we talk about important topics both inside and outside of the church. As always, please make sure that you subscribe and turn on your notifications below to make sure that you see videos like this in the future. I am a huge fan of Martin Luther King Jr. I still remember that one of my favorite gifts of all time that was given to me was a box set of cassette tapes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermons. Take a look at this. Isn't that awesome? I took an extended time and I listened to every single one of them. Huge shout out to Bill and Katie Iverson for such an amazing and thoughtful gift. And I still feel like I'm a newbie with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I could never pretend that I'm some sort of an expert on him and that everyone else doesn't know what they are talking about. All I know is that I have tried to surround myself with his writings and teachings, even if just to absorb a little bit. However, here's what I have to say now. From trying to absorb as much of MLK as possible while at the same time being a part of the white evangelical church, the white church has 100% sterilized and sanitized Dr. King's message. In fact, many of the Christians I know hear the name Dr. King and the first thing that comes to their mind is, oh yes, I have a dream. And they're like, oh yes, I love MLK. And it is so popular to have prayer breakfast every year for MLK Jr. Day, where they invite a black pastor to come and speak, and for many it's the one time a year that they hear a black pastor talk. How people love to rub elbows and network, and they talk about love and peace and equality. People love MLK. And once a year, about people post the most sanitized MLK Jr. quotes on their Facebook pages, because there is something in the back of our minds that says, I have to like MLK. I recognize that if I don't, there's probably something a little bit wrong with me, and there's probably something a little bit racial and some things that I have to deal with, but let's not talk about that right now, because I'd rather find an MLK Jr. quote that agrees with what I believe with, and let's forget about everything else. Truth is, I don't think a lot of Christians would post MLK Jr. quotes on their social media if they actually knew some of the stuff that he actually said. But as we often do, we find the sound bites that we agree with and post those words instead. I want to give Martin Luther King Jr.'s words a spotlight here, front and center. I selected a snippet of quotes that for some reason never get brought up at these prayer breakfasts in predominantly white churches. So today I give to you a selection of some of my favorite parts from a letter from a Birmingham jail. One of the first lines is, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Oh snap, you're calling me unwise and untimely? Seemingly white people know the best times and the best ways for black people to protest, and that hasn't changed today. But then he goes on, you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effect and does not grapple with underlying causes. It's unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. Well, you don't see that one on a bumper sticker, do you? However, literally the same thing is happening today. I have white friends in my life that will decry looting and rioting, but they don't talk near as much about the even more unfortunate thing, which is white power structures right within the United States. Let's go down a bit further. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage a direct action campaign that was well timed, in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ears of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. I can't tell you how many times I've heard white people say, wait, it just isn't time. This isn't the right time. What you find out is that there never is a right time. There never is a right way to do it. They know all the ways that they don't want it to be like, but they don't know what they want it to be like. Billy Graham was the most famous evangelist in U.S. history, and he ardently opposed much of what Dr. King was about. Michael E. Long says this of Graham: "There wasn't a major Protestant leader in America who obstructed King's beloved community more than Billy Graham did." And King continues, "Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, 'Wait.' But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, 'Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?' For Pete's sake, now isn't a good time to talk about it. Back then wasn't a good time to talk about it. When is a good time to talk about it?" And for people who are so upset about breaking laws in today's society, well, Dr. King has some things to say about that as well. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One not only has a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Now, the goofy thing is that Christians use phrases like this to explain ways for why they would rise up against the government. I don't think that's what Dr. King and St. Augustine had in mind when they were talking about these things. Boy, I think you'll have a really hard time finding Jesus' words condoning his followers to rise up against an oppressive government. Actually, it was the opposite. And now we get to my favorite part, and in my opinion, the most powerful part of this letter. I must confess two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action," who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So many good-intentioned people within the church say the exact same thing today. Do they know that their beloved Martin Luther King Jr., who they quote once a year on their Facebook, says this about them? Martin Luther King Jr.'s problems were never with the extremists. They weren't the people in the white hats that were giving the problems. It was the moderates who were sitting right within the churches on Sunday mornings, who didn't want to upset the status quo. And then King delivers this blistering paragraph towards the end. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Might I just remind everyone, this is Martin Luther King Jr., a minister of the church, calling out the church to be better. I've gotten a lot of flack for this before. How dare you, Kyle, say such things to the church? Look, I love the church. I'm actually deeply saddened by the state of the church in the United States. but I can't not talk about it. The church to me today looks much more like nationalism and a lot less like Jesus. It feels a lot more like power and a lot less like humility. It seems to be way more about making its congregants feel comfortable, like inside of a country club or a social club, than loving their neighbor. And in one of his closing lines, Martin Luther King Jr. says this: "Never before have I written so long a letter. I'm afraid it is much too long to take your precious time." He had so much to talk about, so much to address. Alas, I guess it was too long because the white evangelical church didn't finish reading it. Or maybe certain pastors did read it but couldn't talk about these things from the pulpit because they might upset the status quo. They might upset whiteness. Friends, the exact same things and themes that Martin Luther King Jr. was addressing back then are still happening right now today. We must remember this phrase: just because it isn't happening to you or because it isn't happening to your favorite talking head doesn't mean that we get to act like it isn't happening. So many white people are out there today all like, yeah, but Candace Owens said this, or but I saw Tim Scott say this, or the Hodge twins said this thing that I agree with. It doesn't change the fact that Martin Luther King Jr.'s words still ring true for millions of people today who aren't getting paid beaucoup amounts of money to speak on behalf of whiteness. Friends, we are out of time today. I have an exciting announcement though for next week. Next week, I'm going to be interviewing the amazingly talented Derek Kimler, the executive director of Central Illinois Friends. Can't wait for you to hear from him. I'll see you back here next week, same time, same place.